Thank you very much, Mark. I'm really pleased, actually, to be following Dr. Chen and Dr. Jackson, because I'm going to be introducing, I guess if nothing else has convinced you this morning and this afternoon, which I doubt very much, I'm going to tell you the reasons why we need to be looking at this in any event, because these issues that we're talking about and thinking about in our work as teachers, policymakers, curriculum designers, the imperative comes from law and social justice, right? So whether we like it, agree with it or not, this is our responsibility and, in fact, our legal obligation. And this has not been set out more clearly than as it appears in a multitude of international treaties on various human rights. So I'm just going to run through them just to give you a sense of how vastly covered this area is. And it makes no bones about the fact that, without a doubt, we are obliged to ensure equality, non-discrimination, in an accessible and meaningful manner. So substantive equal protection of all rights, of all persons, and their full development and their potential in order that they can thrive as human beings for the world community. So we have this very broad vision cast in the international human rights literature, and that perspective is very much one that Hong Kong embraces if we are going to call ourselves Hong Kong's world city, Asia's world city. We need to take this much more seriously. So Hong Kong has obligations under the Children's Rights Convention, under the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Convention, as also under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, to name just a few of the very many other conventions we are also a party to. And all of these include the right to education, as I've said, full development of human personality, and to enable persons to participate effectively in a free society, and to promote understanding and friendship among all ethnic groups. And in particular, primary education shall be free, secondary education shall be generally accessible, and higher education shall be made equally accessible. So I think that very much sets the tone for the standards that we ought to already, as a fairly affluent society, be implementing. And if we're not there, we really have to ask ourselves why. And who are we excluding from our systems? And I'd like to take the moment to particularly note, we're talking today about ethnic minority children, but more particularly, building on what Liz presented in terms of intersectionality, we are not just binary identities, or if you're either this or that. We are a multitude of identities encapsulated in a single person. And this includes ethnic minorities with special education needs. So as difficult as the education system may be to navigate for ethnic minority parents, it's all that much more difficult for parents who have children with special needs and they are ethnic minority. So we have to question what are the gaps and what do we want to do about them and what we should be doing about them. I'd like to just take a little bit of time to present an overview of who are the people that we're referencing throughout today, because I think it's important to have some visibility of which groups we're talking about. There's a significant population among the ethnic minority community that is under the age of 15, and their numbers outnumber the Hong Kong Chinese population of under 15. And the simple point really is that these are members of Hong Kong's future productive workforce. And that's the order, the descending order in which they appear in terms of the numbers in their population under the age of 15. So Pakistani, Indian, Nepalese, Indonesian, Filipino. All right? And their median ages basically vary greatly compared to the Hong Kong median age. All right? So again, going back to the point about productive capital, despite a larger percentage of school-going persons or at the age of going to school, the percentage of ethnic minority children attending school is generally lower than that of the overall population. So this reinforces the significance of fulfilling, in fact, not just in theory, not just saying, there is equal access to education for everybody, but saying, well, why isn't this then realized in terms of the lived reality of ethnic minority children in Hong Kong? So the reason, as we've heard over the course of today, is there are numerous barriers, not least of which start at the very, very beginning. So as Dr. Ip said in his keynote speech, right at the kindergarten level, if we don't get things right at that level, this barrier then perpetuates throughout the education life of ethnic minority children. There's a lack of opportunity of equal access to appropriate schools. There are restrictions in terms of school choices at all levels of education. A lot of those limitations come with language, but language is not the only limitation. We've read numerous reports in recent months as a result of a study concluded by Hong Kong Unison that sometimes you won't even get an application form if you don't look Chinese, and that's the reality of the ground, on the ground for many parents. There's systemic discrimination in the school system. This has been sadly evidenced by some of the attitudes of teaching staff. I'm very encouraged today, though, to hear that some of those working with the schools who are seeking support for their ethnic minorities have more positive attitudes and really want to make a difference. And I think that that's very, very promising if teachers are starting to take those steps. There is de facto racial segregation in Hong Kong's education system. You find an over-concentration of ethnic minority children in specific Hong Kong schools. That in itself is a form of discrimination, which I'll talk about in a little while. And then, of course, there's the broader challenge of building multicultural schools and classrooms, and that's very much been the focus of Dr. Chen and Dr. Jackson's presentations. It's not just about language. It's about learning about who are the students in your classroom. What is their identity? What other aspects of their life and life challenges are they dealing with as they are moving through the school system? What is their family structure like? What social and other barriers do they have outside of the school setting which they're dealing with? What is their emotional well-being like? So taking an interest in understanding more about the children that we're teaching. And of course, there is the lack of a Chinese as a second language curriculum. We have a framework, but that's not quite the same as actually having a curriculum so that teachers know how to deliver the teaching. And we've heard, again, throughout the course of the day, that the failure of having the tool through which to operationalize the framework means that the policy is just that. It's just a policy. And so how can we provide an inclusive environment that is free from discrimination, where teachers are trained adequately? So it starts with the training level of teachers, incentivizing them from the get-go, before they get into these classrooms, having them anticipate how they're going to deal with ethnic minority children in their schools, in their classrooms, and making this a matter of habit, good practice. And I think some of the material that Dr. Chan shared with us highlight the possibilities and the potential for getting our curriculum right. And bridging with higher education institutions working on these issues is vital. So in the pre-primary education level, just to give you a sense, you can see that there is a lower school attendance rate among the major ethnic minority student groups that I mentioned earlier, with the Filipino group having the largest rate of non-attendance at nearly 20%, compared with the Hong Kong Chinese children. And as we know, early start is what really gets you going all the way. A study done by Professor John Beijing Shone basically showed that new arrival mainland Chinese students, if they started in kindergarten in Hong Kong, they were able to catch up with their Hong Kong counterpart peers by the time they graduated from high school. But the failure to attend kindergarten at a local kindergarten and learn Chinese meant that you play catch up for the rest of your educational career. So very, very significant, something for us to reflect on. And Dr. Yip said a great deal about this. The other findings are the findings from a survey conducted by Hong Kong Unison, which show the over-concentration of ethnic minorities in particular schools. Admission requirements, where ethnic minority children are asked to give their interview in Chinese. With parents who don't speak Chinese, this would be a particular challenge, especially if the child is seeking to enter pre-nursery or kindergarten. There would have been no opportunity for them to acquire the language skills to be able to conduct the interview in Chinese. And as a matter of law then, so moving into the legalities of it, applying a criteria on a particular group for admission, which is one that less people from a particular group are likely to be able to meet, is a form of indirect discrimination, right? So here, the criteria is you interview in Chinese. If you can't, then we cannot consider you. And that is a criteria which has a disproportionately negative impact on ethnic minority children, and therefore it is a form of racial discrimination. Likewise, rendering equal access to a right or an opportunity, if it's not substantive or meaningfully accessible, then you run the same risk of practicing segregation. So I want to jump then to other countries where these issues have appeared before the court, right? So the question is this really racial discrimination? Because the EDB has come up with a policy and is trying to address the problem. And the answer really is that in the European Court of Human Rights, where these issues have arisen, you can see challenges raised by the Roma population, where they were sent to separate schools. The courts have unresoundingly said that this in itself is a form of racial discrimination. Let me just get to the right slide. There we go. So applicants claimed that their education in a remedial school amounted to discrimination based on their Roma origin, and that diagnostic tests that were conducted on them were not individualized, they were culturally biased, and they had become stigmatized after being placed in schools with limited curriculum. And the European Court held that the discrimination based on ethnic origin is a kind of racial discrimination, which is particularly invidious and requires special vigilance. So an apparently neutral and general policy, which disproportionately prejudices a particular group on grounds of race may be indirectly racially discriminatory. The case of Orsis, again, Roma children lacked access to education equal to that enjoyed by other children, and that segregated education increased the risk of their marginalization. Again, the court held that this differential treatment was unjustified and that the state had a positive obligation. They had to take positive measures to help these children quickly acquire fluency in the home language so that they could integrate into the mixed classes. In another case of DH and others, applicants were placed in special schools with their parents' consent. So this goes to EDB's argument that we make the choices to put our children in particular schools. Again, they were criticized because Roma children were overrepresented in special schools and their education rarely went beyond the primary level. There was a very high rate of dropout compared with the general population. So 19% of Roma children were graduating and dropping out of primary school compared with the local population there. And the European Court formed the view that children in special schools were disproportionately high when they were of a Roma background, and this was held to be unjustified. And finally, we've seen cases in the US. Brown v. Board is a very famous case which led to the desegregation movement in the United States, and then Lau v. Nichols, where students of Chinese ethnicity claimed that they lacked equal educational opportunities to learn English. So in essence, if we see that we've got a vicious cycle where children start off on the wrong foot, they end up not being able to access at each level the education that they need in order to thrive in society. And that is the result of discriminatory policies and a lack of effective legislation at the level of delivery. And so this requires teachers and lawmakers to think about and monitor what is happening and who should be held accountable for what is happening. I think going to the discussion in the morning, it's one thing to wait for the EDB to evaluate its own framework, but I don't think one can justify the loss of generations who wait every year to be taught Chinese in an accessible manner so that they can have the equal opportunities that they deserve. This is just a brief chart to show you how all of these factors are interconnected, but the point really being that if children cannot make it through the system and they have to take GCSE Chinese, they cannot get into universities, which means they cannot get into professional jobs. They have a low income, which means they are the groups that are the highest represented in households stricken by poverty. And it's an intergenerational cycle of poverty. So I urge everybody who has the power in this room, and you all do your part to raise awareness, think about the problem, and try to develop collaboratively an effective solution so that we can help get ourselves out of this situation, which is not of our making, but it's certainly something that we all have a vested interest in fixing. Thank you.
Thank you.